As mentioned, my name is Francisco Cintrón, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Notre Dame's Medieval Institute, where I am currently in the midst, or in the weeds, so to speak, of completing my doctoral dissertation. The talk that I am presenting today, The Bishop Sultan and the Priest Wilaya, is in fact an overview of the second chapter of my ongoing dissertation project, which makes me particularly excited to get to share my findings with all of you. The dissertation itself is a study of the adaptation of the Iberian Church, its clergy, and its laity to Islam in medieval Iberia. At its center lies the Arabic translation of the Colectio Hispana, also known as Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas, which I will turn to shortly. My project, titled The Christian Imamate of Al-Andalus, Law, Society, and Christian Community in the Islamic West, mainly seeks to advance the study of Christians in Al-Andalus in two primary ways. One is by exploring the Arabic canons of the Andalusi Church within the unique societal context of Al-Andalus, as I hope to do in this talk as well. Following the lead of scholars of the Eastern churches, such as Lev Weitz, Philip Wood, and the many esteemed speakers of this seminar series, I argue that close contact of Islamic institutions reshaped the Iberian Church in identifiable ways, not the least of which is visible in its legal traditions and institutions. And second, by bringing the study of Christianity in Al-Andalus into much closer conversation with the pioneering work being done on the churches of the medieval Middle East. I am therefore most interested in questions of legal and social history tied to the historical transition from late antique Christianity to early medieval Islam across the Mediterranean. And on this matter, I strongly believe the story of the church in Al-Andalus has much still to tell. In fact, as is all too often lamented, a general lack of documentary sources has actually kept the study of Arabic-speaking Christians in Al-Andalus generally lagging behind the great strides made by scholars of the Eastern churches. Without the material at your disposal, we in turn know comparatively little about the development of the Iberian Church and its institutions under medieval Islam. Because of this dearth of sources, scholars such as the late Manuel Asieng Almanza in 2009 had made the justifiable claim that the field remains where Francisco Javier Simonet had once left us off after the publication of his monumental Historia de los Mozárabes en España in 1898. With that said, of course, the past 2 decades have certainly witnessed great advances on this front, thanks to the tireless work of Iberianists such as Cyril Aye, Juan Pedro Monferrer Sala, Ana Echevarria, and countless others. I think it is now fair to say that the study of Andalusi Christianity has become much more fully entrenched in broader conversations on religious minorities in the Mediterranean and the history of non-Muslims under Islam. And thus our sources are being reevaluated in a whole new light. An important case in point, I believe, is the source that lies at the center of my dissertation, and indeed of my talk today, the Arabic translation of the Colectio Hispana, otherwise known by the title by which it bestows onto itself of Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas, Arabic for the Holy Canon, pictured here in all its glory. For the rest of my time today, I propose to offer a general overview of this unique source and of the latest advances done in its study. I hope to then examine a selection of Arabic canons taken from Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas as they pertain specifically to the theme of clerical authority. For it is in this realm that we can see most clearly, I believe, the Andalusi clergy's very precise borrowing of Islamic political and theological concepts, which is of course a running theme in this seminar series. And I argue that they did so to not only voice in Arabic idioms the sacred traditions of the Latin Church, but also in fact to buttress their ecclesiastical institutions while residing under Muslim rule. In my dissertation and in this talk, I make the case that Christians in Al-Andalus made use of key Arabic terms tied to Muslim political rule, such as Sultan and Wilaya, to redefine the authority of the Christian clergy. Etymologically, both these terms denote different but interrelated facets of the notion of authority, and they thus offer a lens into the evolution of the clergy status in Al-Andalus. To put it perhaps very simply at the outset, I will argue that the word Sultan captured the unique temporal powers of clerics, such as the bishop's rule over his diocese and his financial stewardship of church properties. While wilaya, on the other hand, due to its special affinity to the Islamic theological concept of walaya, captured both the holy status and the spiritual authority of the ordained members of the clergy. They both join imama, that is, imamate, as the defining concepts of the Christian priesthood in the Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas. To turn then, finally, to this source, I need to first acknowledge the pioneering works of Ana Echevarria and Matthias Master, who in addition to their own vital scholarship, had also secured a grant from the Goethe Henkel Foundation to bring an international research team together to study this difficult manuscript. It was, of course, my great privilege and honor to have to form a part of this team prior to the grant's completion in 2024. And I'm happy to say that the team's findings have now been published in an edited volume, which today I will only be able to give a microscopic overview of the immense contributions summarized in this collection. Another excellent outcome of the grant was the publication of at least one of the manuscript's 10 books by Juan Pedro Monferrer Sala. I'm also happy to say that there are more to come in the future, inshallah. With that said, Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas is the name of the only surviving translation of the 7th century Iberian compilation of canons known as the Colectio Hispana. It exists today in the singular Codex of Arabic manuscript 1623 of the Royal Library of San Lorenzo del Escorial. Due to the deterioration of its opening folios, however, the work's original title has been lost. Fortunately, there are multiple occasions within the text where it refers to itself precisely as the Kitab al-Qanun al-Muqaddas, or Book of the Holy Canon. Its editors have recently also adopted the title of Collectio Canonum Arabicorum Ecclesiae Andalusiae, or CCAEA, which is a Latin version of another internal referent found in the collection, Jamia Nawami Salkanisa al-Andalusia, or all of the laws of the Andalusi Church. To this effect, the manuscript comprises 433 parchment folios in Maghrebi script, containing a systematic variant of the Colectio Hispana. The Latin Colectio Hispana was first compiled as a chronological compilation of conciliar acts and papal decretals in the 7th century, therefore prior to Islam's arrival to the Iberian Peninsula in 711. It has its own long history of transmission and revision in Western Europe, and though we know of no possible vorlage from which the Arabic manuscript was copied, we do possess other systematic variants of the Latin Hispana by which we might compare the two versions. And just like these others, Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas organizes its canon legal material according to theme and topic across 10 books. The picture added here shows, for example, the collection's 4th book, titled Al-Mushaf al-Rabia min al-Qanun, and goes on matters of liturgy and baptism. Just perhaps of relevance and interest, the manuscript organizes its materials according to books called Mushaf, in which the material is organized by topics into titles called Razm, and where each canon is called a Bab, in which relevant material is then listed. It's perhaps most clearly visible here in the right image, where we have the green presenting the Razm or title, and each of the red listings then has the heading of each individual canon, the Bab. Additionally, an internal colophon dates the completion of this manuscript to the mid-11th century, specifically 1048. This same colophon also includes a dedication to an Andalusi bishop named Abd al-Malik, whose see sadly remains unknown. Though the origins of the manuscript had also remained unknown for a long time, a recent paleographic work undertaken by Irene Pereira has found fairly conclusive evidence to link the codex to Christian centers in the region of Seville. I should also say that there is sufficient evidence to confirm the circulation of earlier copies of an Arabic Colectio Hispana already in the late 9th century, possibly the early 10th century. For this finding, I'm especially indebted to Matthias Masser. Masser was the first to systematically trace the various chronological layers of Arabic manuscript 1623, noting that one of its two internal colophons had in fact been copied from an earlier manuscript. This embedded colophon preserves the name of an Andalusi priest named Vincentius, who we now know at some earlier point had worked on the translation or perhaps the copying of some precursor to manuscript 1623. Additionally, because we have excerpts of Arabic canons that are quoted in the now lost writings of Hafs ibn al-Barr al-Kuti from the 10th century, we can also posit, therefore, that an Arabic Collectio Hispana had in fact existed in the early 10th century. This is, of course, complicated by the fact that it is quoted in the 13th century by Imam al-Qurtubi's work. Fairly contemporary also with these are the various copies of Latin Hispanas that bear Arabic marginal notations related to its ecclesiastical vocabulary, as you can see on the right. This picture is particularly interesting because you see Latin commentary in Visigothic script, as well as the occasional Arabic marginal note. From these sources, we can also deduce that Andalusi Christians in the 10th and 11th centuries had a vested interest in reading and commenting on the Hispana's contents, specifically in Arabic, possibly offering a paper trail for its history of translation. Now, there is certainly much, much more to say. Because we will be hearing next week about the collection's heretical materials, I will not touch on much of the legal aspects of this manuscript, but will instead focus on the collection's Arabic vocabulary, which is, of course, the focus of my dissertation. But before I finally turn to the canons themselves, I want to briefly also situate this text within the broader history of Christian Arabic literature as a genre, and specifically to the vigorous translation activity undertaken by the Eastern churches. I would like to stress this point a little further. The Arabic translation of the Collectio Hispana can no longer be understood in isolation or as a generic copy of an obsolete text. Rather, it is much more fruitful, and I believe accurate, to see it as the westernmost manifestation of a genre of Arabic Christian legal writing that swept across the wider Islamic world. As scholars of Arabic Christianity have long realized, such as Alexander Traeger, Sidney Griffith, and of course many of the presenters at this seminar series, these translated sources are rich in historical detail, nuanced in their contents, and often deeply influenced by Islam. I only wish to draw attention here to the parallel story that unfolded in the Islamic West, and to encourage us to think expansively of Christian Arabic as a Mediterranean genre. And as I hope to show today, Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas is an immensely valuable historical source. No other text permits such a detailed look at the Iberian Church's development under Islam, much less so from the privileged vantage point of the 11th century. And I think it is also ripe for comparisons with developments in the East. Concerning then the topic of my talk today, the holy authority of the clergy. The canons of Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas provide a particularly useful and unexplored lens. For it is now known that the Collectio Hispana underwent a substantial amount of revision in its translation process. As you'll see, the Andalusi scribes paraphrased, elaborated, and reorganized the Latin canons as they deemed fit. If we read the revised Arabic text as a source, we see that Andalusi Christians were very much capable of reimagining and invigorating their church traditions in a new cultural and societal context. They did so, I argue, by borrowing from the language of Islamic law, doctrine, and governance as it materialized on the Iberian Peninsula. To consider a first example, the spiritual authority of the Iberian clergy was very much bolstered by the use of Islamic idioms, as is visible in the opening to the 11th Council of Toledo's Fifth Canon. The canon itself aims to reform clerical behavior, addressing, quote, the life of the prelates who ought to be an ark of justice. To expand on the moral qualities exalted in the Latin passage, the translators juggled between Christian and Islamic notions of the priesthood. The Arabic canon adds unique details, presented here for the most part highlighted. It reads, "Verily the livelihood of the bishops and priests, who are the imams of the believers, must not be troubled by proceedings of injustice and evil, and not be corrupted by excesses and violations. For it is very obscene that they hasten to recklessness and fickleness and strive for tyranny. They are arcs of justice, fonts of fairness, legislators of truth, and pillars of the faith. It is necessary for them to be vessels of justice and bearers of the law." Hamili al-Sharia. The added material in the passage demonstrates how translation created a space to refine the original text and to voice developing perspectives on church institutions. This description of bishops and priests as the imams of the believers is a novel insertion found throughout the Codex. If we think of such insertions as strategic and deliberate, we can get a sense of the lengths the translators went to confer onto clerics the connotations of spiritual, moral, and legal guidance embedded in the Islamic notion of the imamate, particularly the Sunni notion of the imamate. There is, of course, no sense of infallibility granted to the clergy here, but only associations of upstanding moral character, expertise in law and doctrine, and the right to lead the community. These traits are precisely what the translators wish to emphasize in the rewording of this canon. The image of clerics as pillars of the faith and bearers of the law is certainly not absent in Latin understandings of the priesthood, as the original canon reminds us. But the integration of an Islamic vocabulary helped express in a new context something essential to the Latin Church as the dignity of its priestly offices. I must also add here that these insertions reveal a feature of the Arabic Hispana that was already noted by Ana Echevarria, which is a heightened concern with the conduct of the clergy. Philip Wood, Earl Simonson, and others have each written about a similar preoccupation among Eastern canonists with reforming clerical behavior, particularly to bolster the social standing of religious elites in an Islamic setting. These insertions, I believe, are Iberian manifestations of the same effort. More than a passive translation of the Latin text, dressing clerics in the garb of Muslim imams served to elevate the status of the Christian clergy within the Muslim predominant context of Al-Andalus. And this is how I suggest we might interpret the appearance of the Islamic term imamate or imama in Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas. It perhaps goes without saying, but the imamate was and is an important point of doctrine in the Islamic tradition. It denotes the right to leadership over the Muslim community, and the question of where and with whom it resides has long divided the Islamic world. For Arabic-speaking Christians, the power of the imamate rested squarely in the clergy. In the Arabic Hispana, we find the word used in one instance to translate the term sacerdotium, that is, the priesthood or the office of a priest. In an excerpt from the Decretum of Popularius, it factors into the self-identification of the clergy, translating the phrase "ne nos qui potentissimo sacerdoti administramos officia," or "we who minister the office of the supreme priesthood." And I want to draw attention to the phrase that's here highlighted, which is a direct translation of the Latin, reading the assembly of those who take up the service of the supreme imamate, the Hidmat al-Imam. In Philip Wood's well-known study of the West Syrian patriarch Dionysius of Tilmaher, this same depiction of the priesthood as an imamate was one indicative example of a church redefined by close contact with the Abbasid government. These passages from Al-Andalus prompt us to imagine a similar proximity on the peninsula. And just like the Jacobite patriarch in the East, the Andalusi translators reconceived the priesthood as a Christian imamate, arrogating onto themselves the divinely appointed and politically charged status of the Islamic imamate within their own community. Crucially, however, they also preserved the Christian dimension of the priestly office by qualifying the imamate as an appointed service or ministry, a hidma, never fully losing the distinctive qualities of the Christian clergy. And in this framework is how I believe we might consider the elaboration of what I have labeled an ecclesiastical sultan in al-Qanun al-Muqaddas. Just briefly on this term, its root salata fundamentally denotes a sense of coercive force or authority. It is found, of course, in other Semitic languages, including Hebrew and Syriac, with similar meanings. In the Quran, it carries a moral and religious implication, signifying divine proof of prophethood in addition to power over others. Though not strictly political in nature, the term did eventually enter the vast repertoire of Islamic political language that came to distinguish temporal power from spiritual authority, particularly as it concerned the waning religious roles of the caliphs. By the 11th century, independent sovereigns in the Islamic East had taken up the title of sultan as an epithet for a political ruler. In Andalusi sources, however, the case has been made that sultan denoted the temporal authority projected from the centralized power of the Umayyad Caliphate, and thus signified not the ruler, i.e. the caliph, but the Andalusi state itself. The word Sultan, therefore, captures, I believe, a worldly dominion and authority that is well encapsulated in the Latin terms potestas and autoritas. In my dissertation, what I found is that Sultan primarily achieves three goals when inserted in the text. One is to delimit clerical jurisdictions. The second is to frame the bishop's lordship or rulership over a diocese. And the third is to define and clarify the economic oversight of churches, chiefly done by the bishop in early canon legal sources. Pertinent to the matter of ecclesiastical governance, then, are rulings such as that of the First Council of Orleans, 13th canon. A rather noteworthy ruling in general, it places all the churches of a diocese under a bishop's authority, or potestas. The canon's Arabic header reads, "On the churches built in any district, may they be in the possession and oversight of the bishop, ruler of the province." The primary insertion here comes in the form of the label Sahib al-Qurra, which is of course absent from the Latin header. With no equivalent epithet anywhere in the Latin corpus, the translators seemingly took the title from the ranks of the Umayyad Caliphate, whose provincial governors bore the exact title of Sahib al-Qurra. Evoking these figures, the text portrays bishops in the light of these Muslim state officials, rulers in this case of their own ecclesiastical districts, tied, of course, by the canon's subsequent use of terminology such as sultan. Briefly, I must also note that the term sahib is shared with Eastern Christian canon legal texts, in which sahib also identified a bishop actively occupying a given episcopal seat. What the Latin is cathedra, a notion that's expressed in the Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas by the phrase sahib al-kursi, the ruler of the seat. It effectively designates bishops as occupants of episcopal seats and overseers of their wider diocese, framing in important ways the lordship that they have over these dioceses. But the Arabic canon, the body of the canon, allows us to go further and to consider how the translators employed the administrative language of the Andalusi state. Molding bishops and sees into the political landscape of the caliphate, the canon now reads, "Concerning the churches built across the districts and erected at any time, we have decreed by the statutes of the ancient canons that they are to come under the possession and oversight of the bishop, who holds these districts of his province and his land and their rule in his authority and jurisdiction." Two aspects of this translation hint at important changes in the organization of the church in Al-Andalus, both of which drew heavily from the structure of the Umayyad government. In the first place, as mentioned, the translators reframed episcopal authority, potestas, through key Arabic concepts tied to political rulership, such as sultan, hukum, amir, etc. Of these, I argue sultan is the most prevalent in the manuscript, denoting the bishop's privileges over the collection of tithes and church revenues, particularly, of course, from land holdings, and thus his powers in the overall administration of churches. I might note here, however, that sultan rarely appears alone. It does frequently get qualified by other terms like hukum and amr, etc. and mulk on occasion. In the text, it sorry, I've lost my. Yes, in the manuscript, it labels episcopal rights over the ordination of clerics, the collection of the episcopal third, and the general stewardship of church properties and revenues. A second point of interest lies in its depiction of an Andalusi diocese as a cura, that is, a province made up of minor districts called eclemes, or in the plural, a kalem. It is important to note that both cura and ecleme are two of the core administrative demarcations of the Andalusi state. Each term denotes concrete territorial units within the Andalusi state's fiscal regime, entailing not only a geographical schema, but also a well-organized design for tax extraction and military presence in Al-Andalus. What we are seeing, I believe, is the general substitution of the Visigothic ecclesiastical map with the Caliphate civil map, a development that is likely to have followed the emergence of new topographies of Muslim power on the peninsula. I argue in my dissertation that the Bishop Sultan is crucial to the preservation of these pre-Islamic territorial units, the dioceses, by linking them directly to the Bishop Sultan. Before expanding on this, I want to also emphasize that these terminological changes demonstrate how Andalusi Christians embraced a whole new language of church governance, a language taken, as mentioned, from the government of the Umayyad state. To elucidate how this reads in practice, consider the Arabic translation of the fifth canon of the Second Council of Orleans. Similar to the previous ruling, this canon places all the pious donations given to both urban and rural churches under the oversight of the bishop. Where the Latin refers to the bishop's potestas, the Arabic text instead describes the oversight or jurisdiction, nadar, authority, sultan, and management, tadbir, of the bishop of said cura. When referencing the resources of parishes, the canon refers to the Andalusi eclemes and the villages or cura found in the countryside of these districts. Additional canons throughout the corpus replicate this language, in this case very deliberately embracing the Andalusi state's organizational framework of villages within districts within provinces, what the Arabic is qaryas within eclemes within curas. In each case, the word sultan conspicuously ties these rulings to the jurisdiction of bishops. Akin then to Latin potestas, the Qanun's usage of sultan well conveys to Arabic readers the traditional powers of Christian clerics. In the case of bishops, this ecclesiastical sultan refines rather than reinvents episcopal authority, which remains rooted in the bishop's spiritual and material control over his diocese. Conceptually, it also provides a useful framework in which to declare ancient episcopal privileges, such as the right to ordain clerics and to steward church properties. And I'll conclude this section on sultan by stating that this use of the word is of course not unique to Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas. The Fiqh al-Nazraniyya of the Baghdadi priest Ibn At-Tayyib, for example, also employs sultan much more frequently, I would say, to delimit clerical jurisdictions in much the same way. The ecclesiastical sultan of the Andalusi clergy, I believe, thus represents a shared Christian Arabic formula for the expression of clerical powers. More distinctive, however, is the elaboration of a priestly wilaya through Islamic notions of sacred authority, as I will now examine. Wilaya, I have to apologize at the outset because my skills as an interloper in Islamic theology will fail me. I do not think I could do justice to the complexity of this term, but I will do my best and its various cognates. At its core, the waliya root, or wilaya at least, can be defined as the holding of authority, perhaps a certain sovereign power. And importantly, wilaya and walaya in unvocalized Arabic text you cannot distinguish them. Because I cannot do justice, as mentioned, to the complexity of this term, I am going to rely on Maria Massidakake's explanation. For she writes that both these terms, wilaya and walaya, may serve as verbal nouns expressing the action of waliya, yali, which can mean 1. To be near, adjacent, or close to something. 2. To be a friend or relative of someone. And third, to manage, administer, rule, or govern. So have authority, power, or command. The word walaya may refer to all three actions covered by this verb, as well as the state of being a wali or a maula, but it is most commonly applied to the first two types of actions or states expressed by the verb waliya yali, that is, the state of closeness and nearness, or of friendship and kinship, although it may also be used for the meaning of rule or command. Most Arabic authorities understand the noun wilaya, on the other hand, as referring specifically to a ruling or managerial office, imara, sultan, tadbir. And importantly, the waliya root is also intimately tied to the Quranic ethos, denoting within the Quran in phrases such as the awliya Allah, or friends of God, individuals considered particularly close to God. It is also related to the early Islamic system of patronage, which unfortunately we'll not have time to go into, but it is worth noting that these separate contexts did eventually influence the elaboration of the theological concepts of wilaya amongst both Sufi and Shia figures. I believe it was Vincent Cornell who offered a useful sort of framework of the wilaya paradigm that distinguishes wilaya as denoting the functional aspects of an office or of individuals invested with the authority of an office, while walaya speaks more specifically to the sacred status of that authority, particularly to the state of being close or near to God. However, he also notes the close interdependence of these two terms. In his words, when all is said and done, walaya and wilaya are best seen as semantic fraternal twins that coexist symbiotically like yin and yang. Each relies on the other for its meaning. And indeed, in Al-Kanun al-Muqaddas, the word is very frequently unvocalized. We do have occasions where it is presented as walaya specifically, but if you note here, for example, in the middle image, we have a dot above the wow that might suggest walaya, but without the full vocalization, it is difficult to say for sure. I have chosen in a chapter and in this presentation to focus on wilaya, primarily because the preferred verb used throughout the manuscript is form 2 of the walaya root, walla, denoting typically to establish or appoint a figure into an office. And I'm particularly fascinated by the word because this concept among the clergy in Al-Andalus strangely coalesced around the rite of ordination and the office of the ordained. For this reason, I've come to the tentative conclusion that a priestly wilaya, if we can call it so, expresses both the temporal function of an ordained office, while also capturing, through its Islamic connotations, the sacred status and authority of the ordained clergy. It translates such words as administratio, referring to a bishop's or a priest's time in office, ordinatio, meaning ordination, and indeed ministerium, as I'll show in a second. And I also should mention that I would like to be corrected, and please correct me in the Q&A if this is the case, but I believe it's a strangely unique feature of Al-Kanun al-Muqaddas to have such a preference for the waliya root, whereas in the East we find the sawama root, which is borrowed from Syriac, or the rataba root, meaning grade or rank. We do find the latter in the Arabic collection in Al-Andalus, but I have not found so far sawama, meaning as well ordination or to ordain, in Al-Kanun al-Muqaddas. Perhaps it is the absence of a term such as the sawama root that leads to the proclivity in the text of the waliya root, but I think I need to do further studies into that to confirm. And here we can see, just from this selection of various titles in Al-Kanun al-Muqaddas that focus on the topic of ordination, that it was chiefly the waliya root that was the preferred translation of the word ordinatio. It should be said that in the Latin context, ordinatio was very early on the preferred translation, or I guess, translation of the Greek notion of ordination. It was Tertullian very early on who established this, and the manuscript, the Latin Codex Hispana, preserves this tradition. And perhaps this explains why there is such a systematic choice to constantly translate the text or the word ordinatio through the Waliya root. I particularly want to draw your attention to number 15 and number 42, where the preferred translation of ordinatio is not the typical tauliya, but rather wilaya, particularly in the case of number 42, where the whole phrase to scipere ministerium, to take up the ministry, is translated specifically as wilaya. A similar reliance on this verbal root appears in the collection's translation of the Council of Laodicea's fourth canon. Its Latin version succinctly states that the laying on of hands upon the ordained, the ordinatos, must not be done with catechumens present. The Canone, however, adds details. It is not permitted for clerics to be ordained in the presence of catechumens, those who are not baptized. The laying on of hands upon whoever is to be ordained, manuala, must not be done in the presence of catechumens, but rather it is said piously to the catechumens, step out. Thus is the ordained to be ordained. Through a host of waliya constructs, e.g. tauliya, yuwala, muwala, the Andalusi clergy, I believe, conveyed the procedural and bureaucratic undertones intrinsic to Latin ordinatio. Or at least this is my one theory. While this example, I believe, reveals the Canone's usage of wilaya and its cognates to convey the procedural undertones of Latin ordinatio, the real significance of a priestly wilaya only emerges when considered alongside the religious meanings of Islamic walaya. Founded on Quranic and early Islamic traditions, both Shi'ism and Sufism developed notions of walaya tied to spiritual inheritance exclusive to their communal leaders, Shi'i imams and Sufi sheikhs alike. Over time, these ideas engendered new categories of spiritual distinction based on proximity to God, imbuing walaya with an intrinsic sense of sanctity or sainthood. Among the Shia, it shaped nascent theories of the imamate, beginning of early claims for the legitimacy of Ali ibn Abi Talib as Muhammad's successor. It was also a formative concept in Shiite ideology. Among Sufis, Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi's Khatim al-Awliya, or the Seal of the Saints, laid the foundation for a Sunni doctrine of walaya that responded to the Shia challenge and the political instability of Abbasid rule. In this sort of complex political and theological environment, walaya took center stage alongside imamate, and khilafa, caliphate, in Islamic debates on the spiritual and worldly leadership of the Muslim faithful. And just as they labeled in Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas priests as imams, they also labeled them on occasion as walis. On at least one occasion, the Qanun's translators explicitly appropriated the phrase awliya Allah to the ordained clergy. The final canon of Book 1.26 on the qualities of the diaconate abounds with the waliya construct. Its header, for example, reads, "May the ordinations, tawliyat, of deacons and all the other grades be done on Sunday, after the ordained and the ordainer, al-muwalla wal-muwalli, have fasted on the previous Saturday to prepare for the appointment of wilaya." After a lengthy discussion of the biblical precedent for this practice, the canon concludes, "It is thus right for us to take this example as a model and to act by it. On this day, we ought to perform the mysteries of the clergy's ordinations and their consecrations, because on it was made manifest all the degrees of God's mercy and the sublime gifts for his awliya." More than describing a clerical rank, this reference directly invokes the favored status of the Quranic awliya Allah, bestowing this holy status upon the ordained. In turn, I believe the canon portrays ordination not as a technical bureaucratic procedure, but as a sanctified rite of passage for God's elect. And I should also mention here that I am still working through exactly what to make of this phrase here and how it might be sort of connected to the borrowing of Islamic terminology by the Christian clergy. This internal discourse on the nature of ordination and the holy status of the ordained resonates with the Kakei's treatment of walaya as tied to notions of charismatic leadership. Just as the Shia Imam and its disciples were considered the elected awliya, the Christian clergy also acquired a charisma that set them apart by virtue of their perceived proximity to God. As seen in the language of Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas, Andalusi Christians reconceives the holy status and religious authority of clerics through the Islamic connotations of wilaya/walaya. Bestowed of this priestly wilaya through the rite of ordination or tawliya, the clergy seemingly also received their own sacred inheritance and spiritual distinctions. They became members of an ordained ministry that was charged with fostering a clerical imamate to guide the Christian faithful. Clerical ordinations thus stood at the heart of this Christian appropriation of the Islamic walaya. To conclude then, the Arabic Codex Hispana reveals a wide terminology shared among Muslims and Christians on the Iberian Peninsula. Saras Rumza described its occurrence as authors of different religions, quote, employing the same building blocks to erect their different religious edifices. For scholars of the Eastern churches, such as that of Dionysius of Tilmahar, the use of Islamic building blocks to fortify church institutions is strong evidence of intellectual vigor and historical development. For Iberianists, I believe the Codex Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas offers a useful source to reinterpret the Christians of Al-Andalus as active participants in a Mediterranean discourse about legitimate religious authority. But more than showing the mere linguistic Islamization of this community, I believe the examples I have shown give proof to the broader reorganization of church institutions in Iberia. Possibly to be defined as an Iberian Islamic church, where the clergy formed a Christian imamate and bishops ruled as sultans, this image might help us move beyond earlier perceptions of this community as culturally inflexible and incapable of adaptation. Instead, we begin to see signs of integration and accommodation, efforts that were otherwise successful in the broader medieval Islamic world. I believe what I presented today are Andalusi Christian efforts to belong and grow in an Islamic society, efforts that merit further recognition by scholars of the Islamic East and West. Thank you.